The sound of splintering wood echoed through the grand dining hall as the massive oak beams groaned under the weight of Charleston's heaviest rainfall in decades. William Barrett had precisely 3 seconds to glance up from his brandy before 2 tons of timber and slate came crashing down, burying the wealthy plantation owner beneath what had once been his greatest pride. However, this was no accident. It was 15 years of calculated revenge, carried out by the very man Barrett trusted most with hammer and nail. Moses Carter had spent months weakening every support beam, every joint, every connection holding that ceiling together. And tonight, nature would deliver the final push he required to settle an old debt written in blood and bondage. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The story commences not with the collapse, but with the construction 15 years earlier, when Moses Carter first arrived at the Barrett plantation in 1818. He was 22 then, his large hands already calloused from years of woodworking, his dark eyes holding secrets that would take decades to reveal themselves. William Barrett had bought Moses for $800 at the Charleston slave market, not for his labor, like most men, but for his mind and the magic he performed with timber. Moses possessed what other carpenters in Charleston called the gift, an almost supernatural ability to see the grain of wood, to comprehend how trees desired to be shaped, and to coax beauty from even the most stubborn piece of lumber. He could build anything, furniture to last centuries, houses to withstand the fiercest storms. But more importantly for Barrett's ambitions, he could build them faster and better than any white carpenter in the state. Barrett's mansion stood on Meeting Street, a 3-story monument to Southern wealth, with columns reaching toward heaven and rooms spacious enough to host Charleston's elite. But Barrett wanted more, always more. His wife Eleanor had died giving birth to their stillborn son in 1825, and in his grief and guilt, Barrett immersed himself in expanding the house, as if adding rooms could somehow fill the emptiness echoing through the hollow halls. Moses became Barrett's instrument of architectural ambition, forced to work from dawn until well past sunset, crafting elaborate additions that displayed Barrett's wealth to Charleston society. The breakfast nook with its hand-carved wainscoting, the library with its soaring ceiling and intricate crown molding, the grand staircase curving like a woman's spine, all bore Moses's touch, though none would ever carry his own name. The relationship between master and slave was complex in the manner all such relationships were, built upon a foundation of ownership that neither man could escape. Barrett recognized Moses's talent and treated him better than most masters treated their property, permitting him to keep a small portion of the money earned when Barrett rented out Moses's services to other wealthy families. Moses slept in the carriage house rather than the slave quarters, ate better food than the field hands, and even learned to read by lamplight after Barrett's children had finished their lessons. Yet privilege, even the minor privileges granted to a favored slave, could never erase the fundamental truth of Moses's existence. He was property, an owned thing, a tool utilized for another man's profit and pleasure. Every morning he awoke to the sound of Barrett's voice calling his name. Every day he bent his creative gifts to serve another man's vision. And every night he returned to quarters comfortable for a slave, but which would have been considered a shed for any free man. The turning point arrived in the winter of 1831, during the construction of what Barrett termed his greatest project yet, a massive dining hall intended as the centerpiece for Charleston's social season. The room was to be 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling supported by hand-hewn oak beams Moses had personally selected from trees standing for over a century. Barrett had invited Moses to walk through the planned space before construction started, a rare gesture Moses initially interpreted as respect for his craftsmanship. They stood in what would become the room's center, Barrett gesturing grandly as he described his vision for elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings that would cement his status among Charleston's aristocracy. "This will be your masterpiece, Moses," Barrett had said, his hand resting on Moses's shoulder in what might have seemed a friendly gesture to anyone unaware of the dynamics at play. "When people see this room, they'll know that William Barrett owns the finest carpenter in all of South Carolina." The word "owns" hung in the air between them like smoke from an unquenchable fire. Moses nodded and spoke the expected words. But something shifted in his heart that day. A weight pressing down for years suddenly became unbearable. He was not a craftsman in Barrett's eyes, not an artist or builder, but a possession no different from Barrett's horses, his silver, or his fine china. Construction of the dining hall began in the spring of 1832, and Moses threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Barrett. He spent hours selecting each beam, examining every joint, planning the complex support network meant to hold the massive ceiling in place. The other slaves watched him work with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing Moses was pushing himself beyond his considerable limits. What they couldn't see was the plan forming in Moses's mind, a design within a design that would take over a year to complete. As he fitted each beam into place, Moses made subtle alterations to the traditional construction methods learned over the years. Joints that should have been secured with both dowels and wedges were held by dowels alone. Beams that should have been anchored directly into load-bearing walls were connected via intermediary supports that could be weakened undetected. The modifications were invisible to anyone lacking Moses's deep understanding of structural engineering, and Moses was careful to make them in places Barrett's occasional inspections would never scrutinize closely enough to reveal the truth. The dining hall was completed in the fall of 1832, and Barrett declared it the finest room in Charleston. The ceiling soared 20 feet above the polished pine floors, supported by massive oak beams gleaming with Moses's careful attention. Crystal chandeliers imported from France cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the room could comfortably seat 40 guests around the enormous table Moses had crafted from a single giant cypress tree. Barrett hosted his first grand dinner in the new hall on Christmas Eve of 1832, inviting Charleston's wealthiest families to admire his architectural triumph. Moses watched from the kitchen doorway as guests praised the room's beauty, their voices echoing off the high ceiling he had secretly engineered to fail. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was serving the very people who would attend his owner's funeral should his plan succeed. Throughout the winter and spring of 1833, Moses continued his regular carpentry work while secretly implementing his plan's second phase. During routine maintenance visits to the dining hall, he gradually weakened the connections he had intentionally made vulnerable during construction. A tiny amount of water applied regularly to specific joints caused the wood to swell and contract, loosening connections already bearing excessive weight. Metal brackets were carefully filed down until they held together by friction alone. Support beams were hollowed out in places where damage would remain invisible, yet significantly reduce their load-bearing capacity. The work demanded patience and precision, testing even Moses's considerable skills. Too much damage too quickly would collapse the ceiling before Moses could escape. Too little meant the roof might hold indefinitely. He needed the structure to fail at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right way, with precisely the right person beneath it. Barrett's habits made the timing more predictable than Moses had initially hoped. Every evening after supper, Barrett retired to the dining hall with a bottle of French brandy and his account books, spreading his papers across the great table while reviewing the day's business. He would sit in the same chair every night, directly under the largest overhead beam, the one Moses had most meticulously weakened. Barrett claimed the solitude helped him think, but Moses suspected the ritual was more about surrounding himself with symbols of his wealth and power. The summer of 1833 brought unusual weather to Charleston, with heavy rains arriving every afternoon like clockwork. The moisture in the air was exactly what Moses needed for his plan's final phase. As the ceiling wood responded to humidity by swelling and contracting in ways stressing the already weakened joints, Moses began his departure preparations. In early August, though careful not to alter his routines, attract Barrett's attention, he sold the few possessions allowed to accumulate over the years, converting them to coins easily carried and unlikely to raise questions. He memorized the schedule of ships departing Charleston's harbor, paying particular attention to vessels bound for Caribbean ports, where a man with his skills might find work beyond the reach of American law. The plan required Moses to time his escape with precision, leaving no room for error. He needed to be far enough from the plantation when the ceiling collapsed to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to Charleston to board a ship before his absence was noticed. The window of opportunity lasted perhaps 6 hours from his departure until Barrett's body was discovered and alarms raised. On the evening of August 15, 1833, Moses made his final preparations. Weather reports indicated heavy rain expected throughout the night, exactly the conditions he needed to ensure the ceiling's failure. He had spent the afternoon making final adjustments to the weakened beams using a technique involving loosening connections just enough to fail under water-soaked wood's additional stress, but not so much they would collapse before Barrett took his usual position. Barrett followed his evening routine with the clockwork precision Moses had observed for months. Supper was served at 7. Barrett retired to the dining hall at 8:30 with his brandy and account books, and by 9, he was seated in his usual chair directly beneath the beam Moses had spent over a year preparing for this moment. Moses waited in the carriage house until hearing the first raindrops fall on the roof, then quietly made his way toward the main house. He had memorized every creaking floorboard, every squeaking door hinge, every sound, potentially alerting Barrett to his presence. The storm was intensifying, thunder rolling across the Charleston sky, and rain drumming against the windows with increasing force. The dining hall windows glowed with warm lamplight as Moses approached from the garden, and through the glass he could see Barrett hunched over his papers, completely absorbed in his calculations. The scene struck Moses as fitting. Barrett, surrounded by symbols of wealth built on enslaved people's backs, about to be crushed by the very craftsmanship he had exploited for years. Moses positioned himself to observe the dining hall ceiling while hidden in the darkness outside. The oak beams began groaning under the stress of moisture-swollen wood, and Moses could see slight movement in the connections he had weakened. The sound of straining timber was masked by the storm, but Moses's trained ear detected subtle pitch changes indicating imminent structural failure. At exactly 10:47, by the clock on Barrett's mantelpiece, the first joint gave way with a crack like a rifle shot. Barrett looked up from his papers just in time to see a small shower of plaster dust fall from the ceiling. But before he could react, the second joint failed, then the third. And suddenly, the entire support network was coming apart in a cascade of destruction 15 years in the making. The massive center beam, the one Moses had most carefully prepared, dropped first, striking Barrett across the shoulders and driving his face into the table. The impact shattered the brandy bottle and scattered papers across the room. But Barrett had no time to cry out before the remaining beams followed, crashing down in a symphony of destruction, burying him beneath 2 tons of oak and pine. The collapse took less than 10 seconds from the first crack to the final debris settling, but Moses remained motionless for several minutes, watching for movement beneath the wreckage. Satisfied Barrett was indeed trapped, likely dead, under the fallen ceiling, Moses turned from the house and walked calmly toward the road leading to Charleston's harbor. The The storm provided perfect cover for his escape, rain falling so heavily, anyone sensible stayed indoors. Moses had prepared for this journey by studying every street and alley in Charleston, and he made his way through the city without encountering another soul. The ship he had chosen, a merchant vessel named the Freedom's Dawn, bound for Port-au-Prince, was scheduled to depart with the morning tide, and the captain was known to ask few questions of passengers who paid in advance and kept to themselves. By dawn, Moses stood on the deck of the Freedom's Dawn as Charleston harbor receded behind him, watching the sun rise over a city where he had lived as a slave for 15 years and where he would never return. The ship's other passengers were mostly merchants and a few families relocating to Haiti for business opportunities, and none of them paid particular attention to the quiet black man who kept to himself in the cheapest cabin below deck. News of Barrett's death didn't reach the harbor before the ship's departure, and Moses spent his first day of freedom watching dolphins play in the ship's wake while Charleston grew smaller and smaller on the horizon. He felt none of the celebration he had expected, none of the joy that should have accompanied his liberation, only a deep exhaustion that seemed to settle into his bones like the weight of years he would never recover. The voyage to Haiti took 6 days, and Moses used the time to transform himself from Moses Carter, enslaved carpenter of Charleston, into Matthew Freeman, skilled craftsman seeking opportunity in the Caribbean. He had chosen the name carefully. Matthew for its biblical significance as a man who left his old life behind to follow a new calling, and Freeman for obvious reasons that needed no explanation. Haiti in 1833 was a nation still recovering from the revolution that had ended slavery 30 years earlier. But it was also a place where a black man with skills could make a living without constantly looking over his shoulder for slave catchers. Moses found work within a week of arriving in Port-au-Prince, helping to rebuild churches and schools damaged in recent earthquakes. The work was satisfying in ways Moses had almost forgotten were possible, as he could take pride in creating buildings that served the community rather than glorifying his oppressor's wealth. His reputation as a master craftsman spread quickly through the Haitian capital, and within a year he had established himself as one of the most sought-after builders on the island. But freedom, Moses discovered, was more complicated than he had imagined during his years of planning his escape. The guilt he felt over Barrett's death was unexpected and persistent, not because he regretted his actions, but because he wondered if he could have achieved freedom through less violent means. The nightmares came regularly, dreams where he was back in the collapsed dining hall, watching Barrett die beneath the beams he had weakened, feeling the weight of that death on his conscience in ways he hadn't anticipated. News from Charleston reached him through ship captains and merchants traveling between the islands and the American coast. Barrett's death had been ruled an accident, the result of poor construction techniques and unusually heavy rains that had weakened the roof beyond its capacity. The investigation had been brief and perfunctory, as there seemed no reason to suspect foul play in what appeared a straightforward structural failure. Moses's disappearance had been noted, but without evidence connecting him to Barrett's death, the authorities assumed he had simply taken advantage of the chaos following his master's demise to escape to freedom. Rewards were posted for his return, but the descriptions were vague, and the search efforts half-hearted, as tracking down a single escaped slave wasn't considered worth the expense with no evidence of wrongdoing. Barrett's estate was sold to pay his debts, and the plantation was broken up among several buyers who showed little interest in pursuing the former owner's missing property. The other slaves were sold at auction, scattered to plantations throughout South Carolina and Georgia, their lives disrupted, but continuing in the same patterns of bondage that had shaped Moses's existence for so many years. As months turned to years, Moses found himself becoming genuinely integrated into Haitian society in ways he had never experienced in America. He married a woman named Celeste, who ran a small bakery near the harbor. and they had 2 children who would grow up free in ways their father had never known. The family lived in a house Moses had built with his own hands on land he owned, a concept that still sometimes struck him as miraculous, even years after gaining his freedom. The carpentry business thrived as Haiti's economy gradually recovered from decades of war and political instability. Moses trained apprentices in the traditional techniques he had learned in Charleston, but he also taught them something more valuable: the pride that came from working for themselves rather than enriching others. His workshop became a gathering place for craftsmen throughout Port-au-Prince, a center of learning and community, bearing no resemblance to the isolation he had experienced as Barrett's property. Yet the memories of Charleston never completely faded, and Moses found himself thinking often about the other slaves he had left behind, wondering what had become of them and whether his escape had somehow made their lives more difficult. He sent money when he could through intermediaries, anonymous contributions that helped purchase the freedom of individual slaves or support the families of those still in bondage. The dining hall that had been the instrument of Barrett's destruction and Moses's liberation was never rebuilt. The new owners found the cost of clearing the debris and repairing the structural damage too expensive, and the room remained a sealed tomb, its doors locked and windows boarded over. Neighborhood children whispered it was haunted by Barrett's ghost, and adults crossed themselves passing the house on Meeting Street. But Moses knew there were no ghosts in that room, only the echoes of choices made by desperate people in desperate circumstances. He had used his skills to create something beautiful, serving his own purposes rather than his master's. And while he regretted the necessity of violence, he could not regret the freedom it had purchased. In 1848, 15 years after his escape, Moses received news that South Carolina had passed new laws making it easier for free blacks to purchase the freedom of enslaved relatives. He used a portion of his savings to buy the freedom of 3 people he had known on Barrett's plantation, a gesture costing him nearly everything he had earned, but providing a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The rescued individuals joined Moses in Haiti, where they found the same opportunities for dignity and self-determination that had allowed him to rebuild his life. One became a teacher, another a merchant, and a third followed Moses into the carpentry trade, learning not just the technical skills, but the pride coming from ownership of one's own labor. As Moses grew older, his story became part of the folklore Haitian parents shared with their children, a tale of intelligence triumphing over oppression and patience, defeating immediate gratification. The details were embellished with each telling, the timeline compressed, the dramatic elements enhanced, but the core message remained consistent. Freedom was worth any price, and sometimes justice required taking matters into one's own hands. Moses lived to see slavery abolished in the United States, though he never returned to American soil. He died in 1872 at the age of 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had known only freedom. Their lives were a testament to the courage of a man who had risked everything to escape bondage and had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The dining hall in Charleston was finally demolished in 1885 when the property was sold to developers planning to build modern townhouses on the site. Workers clearing the debris found Barrett's skeleton still pinned beneath the massive center beam, along with the remains of his account books and the brandy bottle shattered in the collapse. The discovery briefly renewed interest in the circumstances of Barrett's death. But by then, Moses Carter was remembered only as a footnote in the property records, an escaped slave whose whereabouts had never been determined. What those investigators could never have known was that every beam in that ceiling had been a carefully crafted instrument of liberation, every joint a declaration of independence, and every weakened connection a statement that some forms of ownership were simply unsustainable. Moses had built his own freedom into the very structure of his oppression, and when the time came, He had brought it all crashing down with the precision of a master craftsman who understood that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can build is an escape route. The legacy of Moses Carter lived on not in the buildings he had constructed for William Barrett, but in the children who grew up free in Haiti, in the former slaves whose freedom he purchased with his earnings, and in the example he provided that intelligence and patience could overcome even the most entrenched systems of repression. He had proven that a man could be enslaved in body, but never in spirit, and that given enough time and determination, even the most powerless person could engineer their own liberation. In the workshops of Port-au-Prince, master carpenters still tell the story of the slave who built his freedom into a ceiling and brought down his master's house beam by beam. They teach their apprentices not just the technical skills of working wood, but the deeper lesson that every tool can be an instrument of liberation for those with the wisdom to use it properly. The sound of hammers and saws in those workshops carries echoes of that night in Charleston, when Moses Carter chose freedom over safety, justice over security, and the uncertain promise of a life lived on his own terms over the comfortable slavery that had defined his existence for so many years. Moses came to us when he was barely more than a boy, but he had hands that could make wood sing. Whitmore continued. Barrett paid $800 for him, which was considerable money for a slave in those days. But Moses was worth every penny, and more. He could look at a tree still growing in the forest and tell you exactly what it would be good for. Could design furniture in his head that would take other craftsmen weeks to plan on paper. Whitmore paused to take a long drink from his whiskey glass, his hands shaking slightly with age or emotion. But there was something else about Moses, something that made me nervous from the very beginning. He watched everything, remembered everything, and he thought about things more deeply than most white men I knew. Barrett treated him well by the standards of the time, gave him privileges that other slaves would have killed for. But I could see in Moses's eyes that privileges weren't the same thing as freedom. The old overseer leaned forward across the scarred wooden table, lowering his voice despite the noise of the crowded tavern. The night that ceiling came down, I was in my cottage about a quarter-mile from the main house, heard the crash clear as thunder, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. By the time I reached the dining hall, Moses was gone. His bed hadn't been slept in. His few belongings were missing, and there wasn't a trace of him anywhere on the property. Richardson's pen moved quickly across his notebook pages, capturing not just Whitmore's words, but the emotion behind them. Do you believe Moses's disappearance was merely coincidental with the ceiling collapse? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey as if the amber liquid held answers to questions he had been asking himself for 18 years. I've had a lot of time to think about that night, and I've reached conclusions that might surprise you. Moses didn't just happen to escape when that ceiling fell. Moses made that ceiling fall. The journalist's pen stopped moving. Are you saying you believe Moses Carter deliberately caused the structural failure that killed William Barrett? I'm saying Moses Carter was the finest carpenter in South Carolina, and if anyone could design a ceiling to collapse at exactly the right moment, it would be him, Whitmore replied. I went back and examined the wreckage after we pulled Barrett's body out, and what I saw didn't make sense for an accidental failure. The beams had been weakened in specific places. Joints had been compromised in ways that wouldn't have been obvious during construction, but would have made the entire structure unstable over time. Richardson felt his pulse quickening as he realized the implications of what Whitmore was suggesting. If what you're saying is true, this would be one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance by an enslaved person ever documented. The planning required, the technical knowledge, the patience to execute such a plan over months or years. Moses was extraordinary in every way, Whitmore agreed. He could have been a great architect or engineer if he had been born free and white, but instead he was trapped in a system that saw him as nothing more than a very valuable tool. Barrett never understood that treating Moses better than other slaves didn't change the fundamental fact that he owned another human being. The conversation with Whitmore led Richardson to other sources: plantation records preserved in Charleston's Historical Society, ship manifests from the harbor master's office, and correspondence between Barrett and other wealthy families who had employed Moses's services. A picture began to emerge of a man whose skills had made him famous throughout the region, but whose legal status had prevented him from ever benefiting from his own talents. Richardson's research also uncovered evidence supporting Whitmore's theory about the dining hall collapse. Technical drawings Moses had prepared for other construction projects showed an understanding of structural engineering remarkably advanced for his time. Load calculations written in Moses's careful handwriting demonstrated mathematical knowledge few formally educated engineers possessed. Most tellingly, several letters from Barrett to business associates mentioned Moses's uncanny ability to predict when buildings would develop structural problems, a skill invaluable for someone planning to cause such problems deliberately. The journalist's investigation took him beyond Charleston to other cities where Moses had worked on various projects during Barrett's frequent loans of his services to friends and business partners. In Savannah, he found the ruins of a warehouse that collapsed in 1830, killing the owner who had been cheating workers of their wages. In Columbia, he discovered records of a church that suffered a mysterious fire in 1820, burning down the office where the pastor kept records of parishioners who had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Each incident occurred when Moses was known to be working in the area, and each targeted someone who had committed acts of particular cruelty or injustice. The pattern was subtle enough that no one had connected the incidents at the time, but Richardson's systematic approach revealed what appeared to be a long campaign of carefully planned retribution. The most startling discovery came from a ship's manifest Richardson found in the Savannah port records. The Freedom's Dawn had indeed departed Charleston for Port-au-Prince on August 16, 1833, exactly one day after Barrett's death. Among the passengers listed was one Matthew Freeman, described as a free man of color traveling to Haiti to establish a carpentry business. The physical description matched what Richardson knew of Moses Carter's appearance, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Richardson's investigation eventually led him to correspond with contacts in Haiti, where he hoped to learn whether Matthew Freeman might have been Moses Carter under an assumed name. The response from a merchant in Port-au-Prince confirmed his suspicions and provided details that transformed his understanding of the story entirely. Matthew Freeman had indeed been well known in Haiti, not just as a skilled carpenter, but as a leader in the community of former American slaves who had found refuge on the island. He had established a school where he taught both carpentry and literacy to young men who had escaped from bondage, and he had used his earnings to purchase the freedom of dozens of enslaved people over his lifetime. But the most significant revelation was that Freeman had kept detailed journals throughout his life in Haiti, documents preserved by his family that contained what appeared to be a full confession of his activities in South Carolina. According to the merchant who had examined the journals, Freeman had not only admitted to causing Barrett's death, but had provided technical details of how he accomplished the seemingly impossible task of engineering a ceiling collapse that would appear accidental. Richardson's excitement at this discovery was tempered by the realization that the journals were in the possession of Freeman's grandson, who was understandably reluctant to share documents potentially incriminating family members, even posthumously. It took months of negotiation and payment of a substantial sum to gain access to the journals. But what Richardson found in those pages exceeded his wildest expectations. Moses Carter, writing as Matthew Freeman, had documented not just his plan to kill Barrett, but his entire philosophy of resistance against slavery. The journals revealed a man who had spent years studying the weaknesses of the system oppressing him, identifying opportunities for sabotage and retribution that would advance freedom while appearing to be accidents or natural disasters. The dining hall ceiling had been only the culmination of a much larger campaign of what Moses called invisible warfare, acts of resistance so carefully planned and executed, they left no trace of human intervention. He had weakened tools plantation owners used to punish slaves, causing them to break at crucial moments. He had introduced flaws into slave quarter construction, making them more comfortable in winter and cooler in summer. Improvements appearing accidental, but actually carefully calculated gifts to his fellow bondsmen. Most remarkably, Moses had developed a communication network with other skilled slaves throughout the region, sharing techniques for subtle sabotage that could improve conditions for enslaved people without alerting masters to deliberate resistance. The network operated for over a decade, spreading what Moses called liberation through craftsmanship to plantations across South Carolina and Georgia. The journals also revealed the emotional cost of Moses's activities, the nightmares and guilt plaguing him even in freedom, and his constant fear his actions might have led to increased surveillance and punishment for other slaves. He agonized over his method's morality, questioning whether violence could ever be justified, even serving liberation. But he ultimately concluded the slavery system itself was so violent, any response was morally acceptable. Richardson's findings created a sensation when published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1852, sparking fierce debates about resistance to slavery and the extent enslaved people had agency in their own liberation. Abolitionists praised Moses Carter as a hero using intelligence and skills to strike a blow against oppression, while slavery defenders condemned him as a terrorist, abusing his master's trust to commit murder. The publicity surrounding Richardson's articles also attracted Frederick Douglass's attention, then one of the most prominent anti-slavery voices. Douglass had himself escaped bondage and understood the desperation driving extreme measures in freedom's pursuit. He wrote extensively about Moses Carter's story, arguing it demonstrated enslaved people's intellectual capacity and right to resist oppression by any means necessary. Moses Carter did what the law would never do, Douglass wrote in a North Star editorial. He brought justice to a man grown wealthy, denying freedom to others. He used the very skills slavery sought to exploit for his liberation, turning the master's investment in his bondage into his escape instrument. The debate over Moses Carter's legacy raged throughout the 1850s, becoming part of the larger national slavery conversation, eventually leading to civil war. His story was cited by both sides, abolitionists as evidence of enslaved people's intelligence and dignity, slavery advocates as proof of the dangers of treating slaves too kindly or allowing them skills turnable against owners. Meanwhile, in Haiti, the man who had been Moses Carter continued quietly building a free community for former slaves. The publicity surrounding Richardson's articles briefly made him famous, but he refused all interview or appearance requests, preferring his work speak for itself. He continued purchasing enslaved people's freedom when possible, and his carpentry school trained dozens of young men, carrying his techniques and philosophy to other Caribbean parts. The school itself became a marvel of workshop and dormitory complex Moses designed, demonstrating architecture's possibilities created for liberation rather than oppression. The buildings were beautiful but practical, designed for easy expansion as the community grew and equipped with hidden passages and concealed storage areas, providing shelter for slavery refugees. Every aspect of the construction reflected Moses's belief that buildings should serve the people who used them rather than proclaiming the wealth and power of their owners. As tensions in the United States moved steadily toward war, Moses found himself increasingly involved in efforts to support the Underground Railroad and other networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. His workshop became a hub for maritime operations that spirited refugees from southern ports to Haiti and other safe havens. And his technical expertise proved invaluable in designing concealed compartments in ships and creating documents that could pass official inspection. The irony was not lost on Moses that his skills as a carpenter, originally forced into service for a master who saw him as property, had become the foundation for a freedom network, challenging the entire system of slavery. The same hands that had built Barrett's dining hall now crafted freedom ships, and the same mind that had engineered a ceiling collapse now designed escape routes, saving hundreds of lives. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought new challenges and opportunities for Moses and his community in Haiti. The Union's desperate need for skilled workers created opportunities for free blacks to serve in support roles, and many of Moses's former students left the island to contribute their skills to the war effort. Moses himself, now 65 years old and showing the effects of decades of hard physical labor, remained in Haiti, but contributed financially to Union causes and continued his work, purchasing freedom for enslaved people whose owners were willing to sell rather than risk losing their human property to military action. The news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Haiti in early 1863, and Moses gathered his extended community to hear the document read aloud in the workshop where he had taught so many young men the skills needed to build lives of dignity and purpose. The moment was bittersweet, a vindication of everything he had worked for, but also a reminder of how long the struggle had taken and how many people had suffered waiting for freedom to arrive through legal channels. As the war continued, Moses began receiving letters from former students and other Caribbean Freedom Network members who had returned to the United States to participate in reconstruction efforts. They wrote of the challenges building new communities for formerly enslaved people, of the resistance encountered from whites refusing to accept slavery's end, and of the desperate need for schools, churches, and other institutions serving free black communities. The requests for Moses to return to the United States and lend his expertise to reconstruction efforts were frequent and heartfelt, but he consistently declined, explaining his commitment was to the community he had built in Haiti and to the continuing work providing refuge for those still needing to escape American racism. At nearly 70 years old, he had earned the right to enjoy the peaceful life he had created. But more importantly, he understood his greatest contribution lay in maintaining the example of what was possible when black people were truly free to develop their talents without constraint. Moses's final major project was constructing a cathedral in Port-au-Prince, a massive undertaking serving as both a place of worship and a symbol of what former slaves could accomplish when their abilities were free to flourish. The building took 5 years to complete and incorporated architectural innovations Moses had developed over decades of work. Techniques maximizing natural light and ventilation while creating spaces inspiring rather than intimidating those who entered. The cathedral's dedication in 1868 drew visitors across the Caribbean and from the United States, where Moses Carter's story had become legendary among both black and white communities. Frederick Douglass himself attended the ceremony, finally meeting the man whose story he had championed for over a decade. The two spent hours conversing, discussing various paths resistance to slavery had taken and the challenges ahead as formerly enslaved people worked building new lives in freedom. "You chose the hardest path," Douglass told Moses during their meeting, "but perhaps it was also the most necessary. You proved we were never the property others claimed us to be, that our minds and souls belonged to us, regardless of what the law said about our bodies." Moses's response revealed the humility always characterizing his approach to his story. I was fortunate to have skills providing opportunities for resistance others didn't have. But every person maintaining dignity in slavery, protecting family, helping others when possible, was fighting the same war I was. I just happened to have tools bringing down a ceiling. The conversation was recorded by a journalist covering the cathedral dedication, providing insights into Moses's personality and philosophy missing from earlier accounts. Despite attention his story received, Moses remained focused on practical matters, discussing techniques building schools and workshops, serving free communities, sharing water system and sanitation improvement plans, improving public health, and offering training young architects and engineers, carrying his methods worldwide. Moses Carter died peacefully in his sleep in 1872, surrounded by the large extended family, created through decades, welcoming refugees and former slaves. His funeral attended by hundreds whose lives touched directly or indirectly through work as carpenter, teacher, and freedom fighter. The cathedral built served as the service site, its soaring interior filled with voices, raised songs, celebrating life and freedom helped achieve. The eulogy delivered by first student David Laurent, arriving Haiti terrified teenager fleeing Louisiana slavery, becoming successful merchant under Moses's guidance. Laurent spoke of Moses not as dramatic hero many preferred, but as teacher, showing by example freedom, built day by day, choice by choice with patience and skill, constructing buildings standing centuries. Moses taught every hammer blow, Liberation Act, choosing makes so, Laurent said. Showed same hands, forced build oppression, monuments, build schools, children, homes, families, churches worship free people. Greatest legacy not ceiling brought down, but community lifted up. Moses Carter's story. Impact reverberated long after death, inspiring generations, craftsmen, architects, engineers, seeing example-proof technical skills, tools, social justice. Methods studied engineering schools, admitting black students post-Civil War. Philosophy building liberation domination, influencing community-centered architecture, development Americas. Late 19th century, former students returned United States participating historically, black colleges, universities, construction, bringing techniques, approaches developed, freedom workshops, Haiti. Buildings created reflected Moses's belief architecture, inspire uplift users, designs emphasizing natural light, open spaces, integration surrounding landscape. Tuskegee Institute, founded Booker Washington 1881, particularly influenced Moses's educational philosophy emphasis, combining practical skills, training, moral education, community development. Washington cited Moses Carter inspiration, praising combination technical excellence, social commitment, model, black education accomplishment. 20th century dawned. Moses Carter's story, new significance. Civil rights activists fighting Jim Crow laws, segregation policies, replacing slavery, racial oppression methods. Example, intelligence, patience, overcoming impossible obstacles resonated. Leaders developing strategies, challenging unjust systems. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing 1903. The souls of black folk included Moses Carter, historical figures demonstrating talented 10th black leadership guiding race full equality. Du Bois particularly impressed Moses's combination practical skills, intellectual sophistication. Seeing example, educated leadership, challenging white supremacist assumptions, black capabilities. Moses Carter's story, new audiences, Harlem Renaissance, 1920s, black writers artists, celebrating African American achievements, exploring resistance empowerment themes. Langston Hughes wrote poem, The Carpenter's Revenge, retelling Moses's story, parable patient planning, skilled execution power. While Claude McKay's novel, The Falling Beam, used the dining hall collapse as a metaphor for the inevitable collapse of all systems based on the exploitation of one race by another. During World War II, Moses Carter's story took on new relevance as black soldiers fighting against fascism abroad questioned why they should accept segregation and discrimination at home. The image of a skilled craftsman using his abilities to strike a blow against oppression resonated with men who had learned technical skills in the military and returned home determined to use those skills, building better communities for families. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s found particular inspiration in Moses's example of long-term strategic thinking and careful preparation. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced Moses Carter in several speeches, praising his patience and intelligence, while also using his story, illustrating dangers forcing people choosing violence as only path freedom. Moses Carter waited 15 years striking blow freedom, King said 1963, Charleston speech delivered near Barrett's mansion site. He used those years perfecting plan-developing skills, preparing moment-acting decisively. We must have same patience determination, but must ensure people waiting 15 years justice. The speech delivered months. King's I Have a Dream, March Washington address, many historians noting similarities presentations, particularly historical examples, illustrating contemporary struggles, emphasis, connection, individual courage, collective liberation. Civil rights movement, achieving major legislative victories. Civil Rights Act, voting rights. Act passage, Moses Carter's story evolved again, becoming less necessary. Violence tale, more intellectual achievement, technical excellence, celebration. Focus shifted Barrett's death roll, accomplishments, educator community builder Haiti. Emphasis, schools. Built lives, transformed education opportunity. Evolution reflected broader changes, American society, understanding slavery, resistance history, increased recognition. Intelligence agency, enslaved people demonstrated oppressive conditions. Moses Carter's story became larger narrative ways. Black people always fought freedom, using available tools, never accepting dehumanization. Slavery, attempted impose. Moses Carter's story entered 21st century historical account, continuing inspiration, people working social justice forms. Technical expertise, strategic thinking, moral commitment combination appealed. Activists, engineers, educators. Seeing example model using professional skills serving larger social goals. Architecture schools, including Moses Carter's story. Courses, social responsibilities, design professionals, career illustrating buildings, construction techniques, reinforcing oppression systems, contributing human liberation. Engineering programs similarly example discussing ethical obligations, technical knowledge, importance, considering social implications, professional work. Dining hall collapse, Moses Carter famous re-examined modern forensic techniques, experts confirming structural failures, clear evidence, deliberate sabotage, sophisticated load-bearing systems, material properties, understanding. Precision required weakening ceiling, collapsing right-time manner, recognized remarkable engineering feat, impressive accomplished mathematical tools, computer modeling modern professionals unavailable. Moses Carter's journals, finally available scholars. Entirety, revealing depth, thinking resistance, freedom, relationship individual action social change. Writing showed man understanding personal liberation, meaningless unless contributing broader slavery. Struggle, life dedicated proving black intelligence, creativity, legal bondage, containment impossibility. Remarkably, journals documented Moses's communication network, skilled slaves south, sophisticated resistance movement, operating decades undetected. Network shared sabotage techniques, education methods, community organizing, mutual support, helping countless people surviving slavery. Horrors, dignity intact. Moses Carter's influence full scope. Clear historians accessing previously hidden documents. Oral histories preserved Black communities' Americas. Students, descendants, carrying techniques, philosophy. Dozens countries, establishing schools, workshops, community organizations, reflecting belief, practical education, social commitment, power. Today, Moses Carter remembered slave carpenter master's sealing, educator, innovator, community leader. Influence extending dramatic moment public attention. Story reminder, oppression resistance forms, intelligence patience, powerful physical courage, unjust systems, maintenance tools tearing down usage possibility. Port-au-Prince established workshop operating today, evolved technical institute, serving Caribbean beyond students. Curriculum includes traditional carpentry construction techniques, expanded embracing modern engineering, sustainable design, community development methods reflecting Moses Carter's belief, technical education, serving human liberation, merely economic advancement. Charleston historical marker stands William Barrett's Mansion Meeting Street site, commemorating wealthy planter slave, labor fortune, enslaved carpenter intelligence determination, proving oppression systems, human spirit, permanent containment, impossibility. Marker violence 1833. Night context, larger human dignity, struggle continuing today. Placement. Moses Carter's story reminds history, shaped famous, powerful, ordinary people, refusing injustice. Acceptance, permanent, available tools, usage, better world-building communities. Hammer saw liberation instruments, wood stone knowledge oppression weapons. Patient planning society, transformation model intelligence, skill, human freedom, unwavering commitment. Seekers. Haiti workshops, America engineering schools, students built community centers, example-inspired technical institutes, hammers, saws sound Moses Carter sealing choice, night echo carrying, entire human bondage system downfall assistance, legacy serving dominating constructed buildings, freely shared profit-hoarded skills, resistance acts, human freedom, dignity, desire unconquerable nature-proof living on.